What if the most important archaeological discovery wasn't a treasure or a lost city, but undeniable proof that compassion is older than civilization itself? For generations, we've pictured prehistoric life as brutal, where only the strongest survived. But that image is being challenged by a silent revolution in science. Using powerful ancient DNA analysis, researchers have unearthed something astonishing. Individuals with Down syndrome who lived thousands of years ago, not hidden or abandoned, but cared for and honored. This changes everything. In a time before hospitals, religion, or moral codes, ancient people gave continuous care to those who needed it most. From the bones of a Neanderthal child in Spain to decorated burials in prehistoric Europe, the evidence is clear. Our ancestors didn't just survive, they nurtured. These discoveries suggest that love, empathy, and inclusion weren't recent inventions but traits deeply embedded in our species. Across different cultures and centuries, children with severe developmental disabilities were not cast aside. They were buried with jewelry, laid to rest in homes, and protected during life. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a broader pattern that rewrites what we thought we knew about early humans. In this video, we'll explore 3 powerful chapters that reveal the truth about prehistoric compassion, a Neanderthal child whose struggle reveals collective care, ancient Homo sapiens whose DNA tells stories of inclusion, and a wider look at how people with disabilities survived against all odds. These are not just bones or statistics. They are stories of care, community, and something profoundly human. Let's uncover how kindness itself might be our oldest trait. Chapter 1. The Neanderthal child who redefined humanity. In the mountainous cave of Cova Negra in eastern Spain, archaeologists unearthed a small skull fragment belonging to a Neanderthal child who lived over 100,000 years ago. This fragile piece, just a few centimeters wide, contained the child's inner ear bones. When analyzed with high-resolution CT scans, researchers found multiple malformations, structural anomalies consistent with the symptoms of Down syndrome, including severe hearing loss, chronic vertigo, and poor balance. The child, affectionately nicknamed Tina by scientists, would have struggled immensely in the harsh Paleolithic environment. She couldn't have heard warnings of danger or the calls of her group, couldn't have walked steadily across rough terrain, and likely suffered frequent disorientation. And yet, Tina lived to be about 6 years old, in a time and place where survival demanded strength, agility, and full physical function. Her continued life is extraordinary. This wasn't a case of momentary protection. It was sustained care over many years. Tina's condition meant she could not contribute to hunting, gathering, or mobility. Her survival implies that her Neanderthal group slowed down for her, carried her when needed, ensured she stayed close, fed her, and protected her. Such continuous support suggests a remarkable degree of empathy and communal responsibility. According to paleoanthropologist Dr. Mercedes Conde Valverde, Tina's life is powerful evidence of true altruism, the kind of help offered without expectation of return. She wasn't just the responsibility of her mother. The whole group had to be involved in her care. This example fundamentally challenges the outdated notion that Neanderthals were emotionally primitive or strictly survival-driven. Instead, it shows that they practiced compassion, inclusion, and care for the vulnerable. And they did so without language, laws, religion, or cultural institutions. They did it instinctively because it was part of who they were. Tina's story, preserved in bone and now decoded by science, forces us to rethink what it means to be human. Her community chose compassion over convenience, inclusion over indifference. That means the roots of love and empathy stretch far deeper into our evolutionary history than once imagined, deep enough to reach a little girl who couldn't keep up, but who was never left behind. Chapter 2. Ancient DNA and the children buried with honor. In 2024, a groundbreaking genetic study examined the DNA of nearly 10,000 ancient human remains across prehistoric Europe, searching specifically for evidence of chromosomal conditions like Down syndrome. Using cutting-edge techniques, scientists were able to detect trisomy 21, the extra copy of chromosome 21 that causes Down syndrome, offering a level of diagnostic accuracy that traditional skeletal analysis could never achieve. Among the oldest confirmed cases was a 6-month-old boy buried 5,500 years ago in a Neolithic tomb in Ireland. This was not a casual disposal of a deceased infant. He was laid to rest in a ceremonial passage tomb typically reserved for those with special significance. The very act of burial in such a location speaks volumes about how this child was perceived by his community, not as a burden but as someone valued and remembered. Another powerful discovery came from the Greek island of Aegina, dating to around 1300 BCE. Here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a 16-month-old girl with Down syndrome who had been buried with an elaborate necklace made of 93 beads, crafted from materials like carnelian and glass paste, items that were not only rare but culturally meaningful. This level of funerary care, especially for a child unable to contribute in a physical or social sense, strongly suggests emotional investment and symbolic importance. But the most striking evidence emerged from Iron Age Spain, in the region of Navarre, between 2,800 and 2,500 years ago. Multiple infants with chromosomal abnormalities were found not in communal cemeteries, but buried within the foundations of homes or significant community buildings. An extraordinary departure from the standard practice of cremation during that era. These burials were intentional and meaningful, sometimes accompanied by items like bronze rings and Mediterranean seashells, further implying these children held a unique place in their society. Researchers from the Autonomous University of Barcelona emphasize that such funerary treatment was highly selective. These were not generic child burials, but deliberately symbolic acts of inclusion. The consistent theme across all these cases, from Ireland to Greece to Spain, is that children with Down syndrome were not discarded or marginalized. On the contrary, they were honored in death, and by implication, likely cared for deeply in life. These archaeological findings dismantle the idea that prehistoric communities only prioritized the strong or able-bodied. Instead, they reveal a far older truth, that even in eras defined by physical hardship, love and empathy persisted. These children who could not speak, walk, or contribute materially were still given burials more elaborate than many adults. That fact alone challenges the survival of the fittest narrative and offers irrefutable evidence that compassion is not a modern invention. It is one of humanity's oldest instincts. Chapter 3. The bigger picture of prehistoric compassion. While the discoveries related to Down syndrome are striking on their own, they form just one part of a much larger and often overlooked narrative, one that reveals a consistent pattern of prehistoric compassion toward individuals with a wide range of physical and developmental disabilities. Across multiple archaeological sites and time periods, scientists have uncovered remains of people who, by all evolutionary logic, should not have survived. Yet they did. In Italy, approximately 11,000 years ago, a young adult known as the Romeo 2 individual was found to have severe dwarfism, a condition that would have significantly impaired mobility, stamina, and self-sufficiency. Despite this, the individual lived into young adulthood, which suggests not only survival, but active social support from others in the group. Going further back, around 95,000 years ago in present-day Israel, archaeologists excavated the remains of a child known as Skull V12, who suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition that causes an abnormal buildup of fluid in the brain, often leading to an enlarged skull and neurological impairment. This child lived to be approximately 3 years old, an age unlikely to be reached without considerable and consistent care. These are not isolated incidents. They are supported by a growing body of evidence indicating that early human communities frequently made accommodations for those who could not contribute to survival in the usual sense. They shared food, carried the immobile, protected the vulnerable, and grieved the loss of those who would never have been considered useful in the Darwinian sense. What makes the confirmed Down syndrome cases even more revealing is that many of the individuals identified were infants or very young children, people who had never had the chance to contribute to their communities at all. Unlike disabled adults who may have once been hunters or caretakers, these children were dependent from the moment they were born. Yet, they were not abandoned. They were cradled, fed, protected, and ultimately quietly buried with dignity. This kind of behavior speaks to a deep, species-wide instinct that values life beyond productivity, an instinct rooted not in logic or utility, but in empathy. When viewed collectively, these archaeological findings challenge the core assumptions of early human life being purely survival-driven. Instead, they paint a different picture, one where compassion is not an anomaly, but a norm. Whether it was a child with spina bifida in prehistoric France, a teenager with scoliosis in ancient Anatolia, or an infant with Down syndrome buried in Bronze Age Spain, each case adds to a broader understanding that prehistoric people didn't just endure, they connected, adapted, and protected. This consistent investment of time, energy, and emotional care tells us that compassion wasn't a cultural invention, it was a biological truth. It reveals that the roots of human kindness run deeper than agriculture, language, or organized religion. Long before we had laws or philosophies to tell us to care for others, we were already doing it. And that enduring instinct to protect the vulnerable may be one of the oldest and most defining traits of what it means to be human. The discoveries of children like Tina and the many others across ancient Europe compel us to rethink what it truly means to be human. For so long, we imagined our ancestors as cold survivalists, driven only by strength and utility. But the archaeological and genetic evidence tells a different story, one of tenderness, sacrifice, and deep emotional bonds. The fact that individuals with Down syndrome and other serious conditions were not only kept alive, but honored in death, reveals that compassion is not a byproduct of modern civilization. It is an ancient inheritance woven into our DNA. Long before hospitals, religions, or ethical systems existed, prehistoric communities cared for the vulnerable simply because they mattered. These acts of kindness weren't strategic, they were sincere. They weren't required, they were chosen. And that choice, made again and again across continents and millennia, reminds us that empathy has always been part of our survival toolkit. It's easy to assume that our modern values are recent evolutions, but these ancient lives prove otherwise. They show us that love is not weakness, that care is not optional, and that inclusion is not new. So the next time someone questions the value of caring for those who cannot give back, remember Tina, the child who lived in silence and dizziness, carried by a people we once called primitive. In her story, and in those quiet graves filled with beads and shells, we find proof that the human heart has always beat with compassion. And perhaps in that truth lies humanity's greatest and oldest strength. Chapter 4. Compassion Beyond Words, the Silent Language of Care. Long before humans developed spoken language, formal religion, or written codes of ethics, they were already expressing something profoundly human: compassion. This chapter explores how prehistoric communities communicated care not through words, but through consistent, selfless action. One of the most powerful examples is that of Shanidar I, a Neanderthal man discovered in Iraq who lived over 45,000 years ago. He suffered from multiple debilitating conditions: partial blindness, a withered arm, hearing loss, and likely a severe limp. And yet, he survived into old age, a feat that would have been impossible without the sustained help of others. His community must have fed him, protected him, and adjusted their routines for years to support his needs. This wasn't an isolated case of survival, but a long-term investment of collective effort and emotional attention. Such examples show that even in the absence of language or institutions, prehistoric people chose empathy over efficiency. They responded to suffering with care, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized the value of every life. We see this in the archaeological record not just through injuries that healed, but in the postures of burials, the placement of bodies, and the presence of symbolic items around the disabled and the young. These silent rituals of feeding the immobile, carrying the weak, and mourning the dependent suggest an emotional depth we often overlook in early humans. Importantly, this care was often extended to individuals who could never give back: infants, the disabled, the elderly. This means it wasn't strategic compassion, it was instinctive, enduring, and sincere. Even before humans could say, "You are not alone," they were already living that truth. These acts of tenderness, repeated over generations and across continents, reveal that kindness was not learned behavior. It was embedded in our biology. Prehistoric compassion was not expressed in speeches or scriptures, but in the way people quietly chose to stay with those who needed them most. In those silent choices, we find the earliest echoes of what it truly means to be human. Chapter 5: Echoes of Compassion in the Cradle of Civilization. As humans transitioned from small, mobile prehistoric groups to the first settled civilizations, one might assume that the harsh demands of early urban life left little room for the weak, the disabled, or those who could not contribute directly to survival or productivity. And yet, archaeological evidence suggests the opposite, that even amid the birth of cities, writing, and organized religion, the ancient instinct to care for the vulnerable not only endured, but evolved. Compassion, it seems, did not fade with complexity, it deepened. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, researchers have uncovered striking examples of this enduring empathy. Excavations at sites like Tel Brak, and Eridu have revealed burials of individuals, some infants, others adults, with clear signs of congenital conditions, severe injuries, or chronic illnesses. These individuals often lived well beyond the age expected given their disabilities, and in many cases were interred with great care. Their graves contain symbolic objects, personal adornments, and even food offerings. These weren't anonymous or marginalized burials. They were meaningful acts of remembrance and inclusion, conducted within societies already governed by complex social, political, and religious systems. One powerful example comes from the site of Tel Brak in northern Syria, one of the world's earliest urban centers. Among the ruins of this ancient city, once home to thousands, archaeologists found a young woman with signs of spina bifida, a condition that would have caused severe mobility issues. She had lived into adolescence, far longer than expected, without modern medicine or mobility aids. Her body was carefully buried near what appears to have been a domestic structure, accompanied by ceramic vessels and personal ornaments. This suggests she was not abandoned or forgotten, but remained a valued part of her household and community until her death. Similarly, at the Royal Cemetery of dating back over 4,000 years, researchers identified remains of individuals, some young children with cranial or skeletal deformities, buried in proximity to elite tombs. These burials were not haphazard. In some cases, the children were laid to rest with precious items, shell jewelry, carved figurines, and carefully arranged grave goods. Though they may never have held power or contributed to labor, they were memorialized with dignity. This burial treatment reflects a cultural logic that valued life not solely for its utility, but for its inherent meaning. It points to an emotional framework that continued to honor the vulnerable even in societies where roles were rigid and survival was tied to economic productivity. What makes these findings even more remarkable is that they occurred in societies that had already developed laws, hierarchies, and formal religions. These weren't instinctive acts carried out in small family groups. They were community-level decisions made within the context of organized civilization. This tells us something profound, that care and inclusion were not pushed aside by progress, but were embedded within it. Even as humans built cities, invented writing, and waged wars, they still found space, physically and emotionally, for the most fragile among them. Moreover, these acts of care were not limited to the dead. Evidence of healed fractures, regrown bone, and long-term degenerative conditions in skeletal remains throughout ancient urban settlements suggests that the living continued to care for the disabled over long periods. Some individuals had broken femurs or fused spines, injuries that would have rendered them immobile, and yet they survived for years. They were fed, protected, and supported in their daily needs. These were not short-term acts of charity, but ongoing commitments to people who could give little in return, at least in the material sense. This continuity, from Paleolithic burials to Mesopotamian tombs, offers a crucial perspective. It shows that compassion was not replaced by civilization. It was preserved, codified, and in many ways expanded. While early humans in caves may have expressed care through instinct, these early civilizations did so through ritual, symbolism, and cultural memory. The decision to include disabled individuals in family graves, to decorate their resting places, and to surround them with offerings speaks to a value system that saw worth in every life. These findings fundamentally challenge modern assumptions about progress. We often associate civilization with logic, law, and structure, imagining a shift away from emotional spontaneity, but the archaeological record shows otherwise. As we built temples, we still carried the weak. As we wrote laws, we still honored the dependent. And as we expanded trade and empire, we still made room for the child who could not walk and the elder who could no longer see. In these ancient choices, to protect, to nurture, to remember, we see echoes of something deeply and enduringly human. Compassion did not begin with hospitals or humanitarianism. It began with hands that carried the fragile, with arms that wrapped around the sick, and with hearts that saw value beyond ability. Civilization didn't create empathy. It gave it new ways to shine.